no Cupid questions. All
Oh,
questions welcome.
oh,
The reality of it is that there's so much that we don't know. You can't be afraid to just dive right in. I told a little story this morning, and I'll tell it again because I think it kind of makes the point. Um, Makes one of the points that I wanted to do today is that I was in law school and there was an alternative dispute resolution competition. Did I tell you about this, Dad, that I was doing
eh,
that?
no,
So one of the things my roommate and I, we were partners, and this is one of the competitions where you and your partner are interviewing potential clients, and they come into your office, and you're supposed to ask them 1,000 questions and figure out, whether they would be a case that you should take on or not. And this story gets a little dark before it gets better, but this lady walks in and she's a paid actress. It's all pretend. And she's got a script that she has to follow. So her script is that her son was touched inappropriately at school, pretty nasty topic. And she's
right.
hysterically crying and going on and on. And my partner and I, we're, 22, 23, and we're just kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, totally confused. And we kind of lost track of what our job was. We didn't really get to, we didn't really pry too much. We asked what we thought were tough questions, but we didn't really hammer it in. And when she ended up leaving, we said, all right, we would like to take her on as a client. We think that she has a very valid case and we'd like to help her and her family. And the
Right.
judges failed us. We got a big old F
Oh,
on
I
that.
remember that now. You
And
didn't know how he was touched, did
that's
you?
right. We
Yes.
didn't ask the most
Too
important
awkward. Too
question.
awkward.
We didn't want to be awkward. We didn't want to pry, but that was literally our job. Our job was to pry.
Yeah,
She
you could
wasn't
have been
coming
touched
to
something.
us. Yeah, this wasn't a soap. This wasn't, just like drama. Like this was literally our job, and we were supposed to know this information. We were supposed to be the one that kind of put an end to it and said, all right, here's what you have to do. But the only way you can do that is by asking those tough questions. So
Yeah,
I would empower you guys to think that same way because that was very an important part of my learning curve because I learned very quickly, oh, there's no more room for that. I can't be shy. I'm no longer a child. I'm no longer going to, be told, don't ask, don't ask. No, no, it's like, no, this is what we're supposed to do. It's why we're being hired. It's why we're good. It's the only way we could ever be good. You ever have any moments like that, Dad?
I mean, all the time. I mean, to use a terrible metaphor, it's like going to the doctors. I mean, you're put in very embarrassing situations, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
You can't help people unless you know the nitty gritty details. And I get yeah, he was mean or he had a bad tone, and I'll be like, well, what exactly was said? Did they use the F word? Did they curse? Did they threaten? No. Well, it's hard to litigate over a tone, so you need details that can be testified to in a court of law.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, exactly. And it gets more complex from there even. I had a call this morning about a termination. So buyer is under contract, they have a
right.
financing contingency, and then they sent a termination. And so on the phone, the listing agent, pretty upset, made a very compelling case that obviously this was not a proper termination. Before I jumped in and agreed with them, I needed to do my research. And that's all we have to do. We can't just jump in and agree. We can't just, rally the troops without more information. Got to really get into the details. And so what I asked him was, I said, send me the listing agreement, or not the listing agreement, send me the contract, send me the termination. I need to see all the relevant details. Because in this case, the important part was what were they denied for? And then, that was probably the most relevant part. One of the questions he had was, well, it's past the financing contingency period. And I said, maybe, let me look at it. And Dad, as you know, it's a NABOR contract. And
Neighbor.
And so the time period on a financing contingency doesn't really apply. Not necessarily in this case because it was never waived. So I was able to quickly tell them, all right, we can't make that argument. The finance contingency still applies, but let's look at the termination. Let's see if it's a valid termination. So you ever gone through stuff like that? What
Oh,
what do
yeah,
you look
well,
at when I look at a termination?
with NABOR, I look for the letter of adverse credit determination because that's what the paragraph 4 asks for, and it has to be something that relates to the person or the property. You know, and it's a form where they check off blocks, you know, turned down for lack of income, excessive debt load, low appraisal, things like that. If it's not something like that, you know, the buyer has a hard time terminating. If it's just a letter from a loan officer up in Connecticut, you don't, one, it doesn't comply with 4. It's not a letter of adverse determination. It doesn't specify the reasons.
Yeah.
And it's very specified reasons. And some of those reasons extend out if the buyer waives the financing contingency. So we have to look at all that. And it's ultimately something for a judge to decide because we don't know if the buyer made a good faith effort to get the loan, or did the buyer apply for a loan that was different than what was in the contract, which happens quite a bit.
Yeah,
A lot.
exactly. So we had this scenario, which I haven't fully analyzed just yet, but it seemingly is based on the buyer's inability to get a specific kind of loan. They were looking for not only a loan against the purchase price, but they also wanted an additional loan for rehab. And that amount, which was not stated on the contract,
Ah,
is way higher than what they told the seller originally. And they got denied for debt to income ratio or something along those lines.
yeah.
Credit worthiness, something in the lines where they just weren't able to get that big loan, but the contract didn't necessarily protect them on the big loan.
They didn't,
Um,
they put in the contract that it was subject to them getting a loan for both the purchase price and the home improvements.
Yeah, in this case, seemingly it was just, 80% of the purchase price conventional loan. And what they applied for was a rehab loan, not conventional loan, for significantly more than the purchase price. And they
I
got
know there's
denied.
case law out there on this. If you don't apply for the loan in the contract, I know with Farbar that, you know, it doesn't help you.
Yeah, FAR it's very clear cut. And my argument would be you kind of have to follow those same rules. If you don't apply for the loan you told them you were applying for,
Right.
you're probably not going to be able to use that contingency. Another example would be, let's say you said you were going to apply for an FHA loan, but instead you applied for a conventional, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, you don't have that kind of contingency. You only have a contingency for a conventional or FHA loan. You don't have the other one.
Well, typically the buyer puts in what they think they want to get, then they go to the loan officer, the contract signed with that. Then they go to the loan officer and the loan officer says, we have a real deal over here. You
Yeah,
could save a lot of money if you go with this kind of loan, and they don't even think that they're invalidating, you
their
know, their
contract.
in their contract.
Yeah,
It
absolutely.
doesn't occur to them.
Another interesting point. So in that same vein on financing contingencies is that there is an appraisal addendum that's available for, I think, both FARBAR, especially NABOR, but you
Yeah.
can add that appraisal addendum. And my point to most people that ask is, I say, you don't have to worry about the appraisal addendum if you already have a financing contingency. Is that your opinion?
Depends upon if they're going for an 80% loan. If they're going for a 50% loan, you can have a lower appraisal, lower than the purchase price, for example, and still qualify for that loan. So $800,000 deal, and the contract says they're applying for a
Well, I
$400,000.
guess my point's a little different. A finance contingency already has language about an appraisal. The property has to appraise. It's already in there. So just a simple side note, I don't think you need to add an appraisal addendum if you've already got a financing contingency. You're already covered. So yeah, I know there is language that the property has to be approved and the borrower has to be approved. And I think that's a really important key, going back to the no Cupid questions. you've got HOAs or condo associations that also are part of that property. And so even if you have a very well qualified buyer, I think you should still have a financing contingency if it's in a condo, because the condo could have some things that make it impossible to get the loan. The borrower's, well qualified, they're putting a huge deposit down, maybe 50% or more. But if the condo association is not run in a certain way, it could get denied for that reason. So finance contingency would be really helpful if it's a condo, because you can't control those sorts of things.
Well, and banks now with condos are asking for a much more, it's an 8-page report they want from the association, including they want to see 6 months generally of board of director minutes. They
Right.
want to see what people's going to do about the funding for reserves by year end.
So here's another scenario that came up that I thought was kind of fun, maybe a little more stressful than we wanted. We had a closing, it's about a $430,000 closing, first-time home buyers. So I was really excited for them. But the
Right.
appraisal came in at $390,000. It was $40,000 less than the original purchase price. And so the buyer's agent called me and asked, "What do we do? What do we do?" He was nervous. He had spent some time with the buyer talking about what they could afford, what we need to ask for. And in my opinion, I'm always thinking strategy. There was a side question that we needed to answer as well. But the first thing I would do is you ask for a price reduction, right, Dad? Is that what you would do?
I would ask for a price reduction. I would caution my buyer that appraisals are far from exact. I think in real estate school, they tell people it's an art, not a science.
Yeah,
There's a lot of give.
but they do matter. So if you have a buyer that can afford to come up extra, then we
Right,
can do it, right?
right,
But this was a first-time home buyer, they couldn't afford to come out of pocket an additional $40,000. That wasn't ever going to happen. And I would say, even if you had all the money in the world, the first move is ask for a price reduction.
doesn't
Um,
hurt.
it doesn't hurt, and it's exactly what you should do. So you send over an amendment saying the purchase price shall be 390,000. And then you call the listing agent, or in this case, we call the seller and say, "Hey, the appraisal came in at 390. As you know, this is a first-time home buyer. In this case, they were getting a 95% loan to value. So
Mhm.
they really weren't coming out of pocket very much because they couldn't afford to. And
Right,
then this was going to kind of kill them even more." So we go to them, we say, "Hey, 390, I'm so sorry, if we would pay more if we could." And the seller, freaks out, "Oh my gosh, this is the worst." And and then we start coming, "Well, let's talk to the buyer. We'll see if they can meet you halfway, if they can meet you, come up 5,000, 10,000." Dad, if you remember, I did this on my purchase, my very first house that I bought.
the
I was under
condo.
contract. I think we were under contract for like 280. The appraisal came in at 250, and I came back to him and said, "Hey, here's the appraisal. I'll come to 255, but I literally can't afford a dollar
Right,
extra. That's all I can do." And it's because you're coming out the five extra, plus your mortgage amount is going to come down slightly.
right.
So you have to kind of make sure you have the cash to do that. And the seller, I didn't know if he was going to say yes or no. He could have said no, in which point I could have terminated. But in my case, the seller he appreciated that I was coming out of pocket and said, "All
Yeah.
right, let's do it. Let's make it happen." In this case, however, the seller wasn't anywhere close. He just couldn't stomach coming down even a penny. So unfortunately, we had to terminate that deal. That one was unfortunate.
If we're on the seller side in deals like this, I ask them about the carrying cost of the property. You're going to have to put it back on the market if your carrying costs are significant, mortgages and taxes and other things. You got to put it back on the market. You don't know how long it's going to take to ultimately close. And are you really saving anything by saying no to Christian Ross in this case?
Right. You got to think more practically about it. Other
Yeah,
options you can do in that scenario, you can go back to the appraiser and see if they can reevaluate some of their comps. Maybe they missed something. Maybe they were a little too, they were penalizing too much over this versus that. So sometimes you can bridge the gap just by going to the appraiser a little bit. We were hopeful in that case that maybe the appraiser would come up $5,000 or $10,000, bring us to close to 400. Then maybe the buyer could come out of pocket $5,000, maybe 10. But the seller, when he was steadfast that he would not change the price, we terminated. And Dad, you and I have done videos on this before, but how do you terminate a sales contract in this scenario? What would you do?
If I'm the buyer,
Yep.
well,
Physically, what's the process for terminating?
there's Neighbor has a form which you can use. You can check off, with the financing clause. But again, you got to look at paragraph 4 and supply the letter of adverse determination with the appropriate block on that checked off. And you email it, then you call the other agent. Did you get it? Make a note to your file confirming that they got it. So there's no question. And plus, you're getting a feel for how the seller might respond to it. Are they going to agree and allow a release of your deposit, or is this something that's going to have to be, dealt with by the courts? Did the buyer act in good faith?
So in this case, it was actually a FAR contract. So FAR, there is no termination form like that. So what you and I will do in those scenarios separately is we'll get an email from the buyer, we'll forward it to the listing agent saying the buyer is terminating, see below. And then, like you said, we'll attach the appraisal and specify per their rights under the financing contingency, the buyer's terminating. And then I always say one other thing, maybe two other things. One, I always attach the termination and release form. And FAR has one of those, as well as Nabor has one.
Right.
Both buyer and seller sign it, and it says where the deposit is going to go. So that kind of relieves any pressure about that deposit. And so, the deposit release form is attached, or I think it's called cancellation and release on FAR. So you attach that, and then you say, if you ever have a change of heart on the price, please come back to us. We'd be very interested in making a deal happen. What was interesting about that deal, and this is why I remember it so much, I think the appraisal thing was pretty straightforward. The problem was it was on the same day that the second deposit was due. And so this was actually a FAR contract. Now, I should have known it was a FAR contract, but I just assumed it was a Nabor contract because it was in Naples. I think it was in Naples. So I just assumed it was a Nabor contract, but it was FAR. And when the agent called me, he said, hey, the appraisal came in low and the second deposit is due. What do I do? What do I do? And I'm kind of thinking two things here. One, time is not of the essence, right? If it's Nabor.
FAR.
Yeah, I know. So again, I made the mistake. I made the Cupid mistake. I assumed Nabor and said, all right, time's not of the essence. Let's just put the deposit on the back burner. I don't want the buyer putting in more money just so that she can get it back tomorrow. Like I don't think that makes any sense. Let's just put that to the side for now and deal with the appraisal. And I told the agent, I said, let's put together an amendment. Purchase price shall be, let's have the buyer sign it and immediately send it over to the listing agent, and then call them, like you said, call them. Hey, here's the deal. I've sent you the appraisal, I've sent you the amendment. We'd like to make a deal happen. And depending on how the seller responds, this is what I told the buyer's agent, depending how they respond, then we can decide whether to make the second deposit or not. Like, for example, what I was thinking is maybe the seller would say, wow, I don't know, maybe, can the buyer come up at all? Like if I got that kind of vibe, I would have told the buyer, all right, let's make a good show. Let's put the second deposit down. And then let's see if I can whittle the seller down to a number that's palatable, something we can afford.
There's no lawyer on the other side, Christian.
What'd you say?
The seller didn't have a lawyer representing him or her?
So the seller did, and that's where it got really complicated. Really complicated. All right, so now we'll fast forward. That was in my head. That's what I was thinking. And this was at maybe 10 a.m. So at 10 a.m., I'm thinking, we've got hours. Let's just get a good answer from the seller or their listing agent. We're just going through agents at this point. I'm not doing any of it. The agents are talking. So I'm thinking, let's just get this information. Let's see what the seller's going to respond with. And then we'll decide what to do with the deposit. Then we'll decide what the amendment will look like. Well, I think it was like 6 hours later, 4 o'clock.
Oh, God.
That was the first time I realized it was a FAR contract. And it was because the buyer's agent was panicked. As far as I know, the buyer's agent had not called the listing agent, hadn't done anything with it. It kind of just, maybe had other things that were going on. And then finally, the attorney, the seller's attorney, started asking about the deposit. Where's the deposit? Where's the deposit? And he's getting nervous because we don't have it. My office, if we don't have it, we don't have it. And we'll tell them.
$1,000 deposit, second deposit?
It was the first deposit was 10 and the second would be 10. I think that's what it was.
On a $400,000 deal?
Yeah.
Right.
So that's where we were going. And then the pressure started and the buyer's agent's freaking out. And I said, well, did you ever call the listing agent and tell him about the price? He goes, well, no. What are we doing? So here's what we did. There was, at this point, it was, I think by 5 o'clock, we couldn't get a deposit anyways from the buyer. That wasn't going to happen. And the attorney for the seller started kind of breathing fire at us. Where's the deposit? Where's the deposit? And he's highlighting portions of the contract. Time is of the essence because it is FAR. And I'm like, oh no. And you're at risk of this, and we're going to do that, and we're going to terminate you. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is ridiculous. So finally, the buyer's agent calls the listing agent and they say unequivocally, no, not doing it, not going to happen. We're not coming down in price, certainly not coming down anything close to what the buyer needs.
Yeah.
So what did I do, Dad? What did we do? It's 8 o'clock. My kids are finally in bed.
It's a FAR contract.
FAR contract.
I don't know what you did. I mean, the buyer, did you contact?
I like this. I like this game. We should play this more often.
Idea. My phone will be off at 8 o'clock.
Stump the law. We terminated. Because the reality is the seller wasn't coming down. And even if he was, it probably wasn't going to happen tonight. And in the meantime, the buyer's deposit would be at risk. And it was such a long shot that it was going to actually happen.
You were within the loan approval period in the FAR contract?
We were within the loan approval period. Yeah.
So
I think it was like a 30-day loan approval period, and we were on day 15.
You sent something saying you didn't get loan approval and you're terminating.
I sent an email to the seller's attorney. The buyer hereby terminates. The appraisal was at 390. As you may or may not already know, the appraisal came in at 390 and the seller won't adjust his price. We hereby terminate. We'll be sending you a copy of the appraisal and the cancellation and release form. And then I said, please acknowledge that you received it. Now, it really took the wind out of the seller's attorney's sail because he thought he had us dead to rights. He thought, oh my gosh, we're going to keep the deposit. He even threatened to sue us for the unmade deposit, which is a thing under FAR.
They sue the seller for that. They can't sue.
They sue the buyer. They could sue the buyer for the deposits made or agreed to be made. So he was really coming at us hard, and unfortunately, that's how we had to deal with it. And the learning curve on that one was, I really need to make sure I'm asking, is this a FAR or NABOR? I got to get my hands dirty, Well,
I mean, honestly, Chris, that's like the first question I asked because the answer.
I should have. I made the assumption, and look what happened.
Well,
it caused all this stress when it probably didn't change anything. We probably were still going to terminate no matter what. And even the day after, 2 days after, they still weren't coming down.
And it is kind of rare to see FAR in Collier. I mean, but it does happen once in a while.
Yeah. I thought that one was fun. Mike, you probably gotten some challenging war stories like that recently, some stress.
Oh yeah, and I apologize. I drove from Marco Island to get here, and it took me an hour. to get from
Oh,
Marco to this office. And in about 6 minutes, I got to leave to get my ashes. So crazy day. The one thing I'll throw in, Christian, is sometimes the seller's real estate agent can hold the deal together by letting the seller know what's going on in the market. In other words, if you have a rapidly rising inventory, which we kind of have right now, and the feeling is that pricing might suffer, you know, down the road, the seller might need to factor that in, and he might find that by giving up a little, he's not chasing the market, so to speak.
That's a good
So
point.
yeah. So there's a movie that I really like. It's called Margin Call. I think that's what it's called.
Sounds like a
And they had the CEO of this. It's about the mortgage crisis of 2008 and how one of these big banks realized that their mortgage-backed securities were going to be worth a lot less than, or they were going to be the debt was going to be worth more, the liability was going to be worth more than the whole company combined. And so the CEO comes into the room in the middle of the night and he says, "You know how I got in this position? You know how I make all the big bucks?" And they all look at him blankly, like, "I don't know why. Why? Well, I'm curious." They said, "Because I'm supposed to know when the music is going to stop, start, or pick up. You know, I'm supposed to know that." And I think it's so true. That is part of our job. We're supposed to know whether the music is still playing or not, whether the musical chairs is still happening, whether, you know, prices are going up or down or stalled. He also says something that I really like in that same scene. He says, "There are only three ways to make money in this business: be the first, cheat, or be the smartest." I think that's what it was. It's like, be the smartest, be the first, or cheat. And he says, "I don't cheat. And as smart as I think I am, I'm not that much smarter than everybody else." Says, "So if I want to do something, I better be the first. That's a lot easier just to be first." I think it's such a great line because,
yeah.
Mike, you make a good point. If you look around at the music and see if it's still playing, one of the options would be just to be the first. If you know, and I had a client this week, they had to go back on the market, and there are 37 other properties just like his, and that he's
Is it a
competing for.
condo?
And it's a no, I think it's a like a villa, one of those attached homes. So just sitting there, all of
Yeah.
them are within 20, 30,000 of each other. And I told him, I said, "You either got to be the first or the cheapest, or you're going to be sticking around like the rest of them. Like you're gonna be there waiting." And unfortunately, that's kind of the case in some scenarios. Not always, not always, but you got to be aware of what else is selling and why it's selling.
I always think John Rockefeller had a saying: "You don't go broke making a profit." You know, if you already made a lot of money on this property, if this is the seller and they already made a lot of money, don't try to squeeze the last 10% out of it and
Yeah.
potentially lose much more.
We had a seller in the office yesterday who he said he was looking at all his neighbors and what they were selling for, and they were at like 350, 360, 380. And his house, it wasn't updated, it needed some work. So he did it at 290. 290 was his number, and he immediately got a buyer. And he's
Mhm.
sold. As of today, he is sold. Everyone else is still listed, not even pending.
And you
And
probably pay something for it.
he didn't pay anything. He still made a profit. He left a little bit in the profit for the next guy. Who was it,
Yep.
Earl Fry, that said that to you, Dad? Leave a little
Yep.
bit in the profit for the next
Yep.
one.
Yep.
So I
one
think
of his
that's pretty
favorite
neat.
sayings.
So it's, you know, there's a lot here. There's a lot going on. I think that we have to empower our clients to make decisions. We have to have the facts. We have to have opinions, but then we empower them to actually act on it. And I'll end with one last thing. You know, today was kind of a mortgage heavy day. I heard it on a sales meeting earlier today as well. But I had a couple of agents recently who said, "You know, I just don't know that much about mortgages. Most of my closings are all cash. And I
Wow.
really need to know more about them. And I wish I did know more about them. And I said the same thing to both of those agents. I said, it's not just you. There are not that many mortgages in this town. 75% of our deals are all cash. Maybe some people it's more like 50-50, but in our office, it's a big number. And especially if it's a popular property, they're cash offers. So I don't expect people to be good at mortgages. The only way I got any good at mortgages is we were doing 99% all mortgage up in Atlanta. That was
Yeah.
the only thing we did.
I
So
mean,
I think
I-
that's really powerful.
I just tell the realtors, whether it's neighbor or far bar, that if you're brand new, you really have to focus on the financing clauses as well as the inspection clauses, because
Yeah.
those are, if I'm starting from scratch, those are the first two things I'd be looking at.
I agree. The timelines matter, and understanding, what the obligations of everyone is. I think that's huge. And then you got to lean on the people that you trust. You got to have a good lender, got to have a good attorney, title company that can help you with that stuff. Because you're not supposed to know all of it. You're supposed to kind of just issue spot, make sure the dates are right, make sure you're giving people good advice or empowering them to make good decisions. That's kind of all we can do. But don't be afraid to have these conversations. That's the key.
I tell the realtors, if you don't have to know all this stuff, all you have to do is say that, that's a great question, Chris. Let me call, say, Christian Ross, he's on my team, and he'll give you the answer. So they get credit, indirect credit, because you're a part of the team.
Agreed. Love it. All right, well, we've got a lot more of these Cupid questions to come. If anyone has a topic they want us to discuss, please let me know. But I've got a list of 52 Cupid questions, a lot of them. But we'll call that a day for now.